I got my phone because I was texting my doula the whole time this was happening, going into labor with induction, so I wanted to make sure I was getting the facts right. But yeah, so we were sent to triage from the ultrasound technician and the doctor that we talked to regarding her low amniotic fluid, and they were really busy that night, so I guess it was like 4 or 5 in the afternoon now, and I sat in triage for a couple hours while Alex went back home to take care of our dog, and then he came back with, prepared to stay for several days, or not several days, a whole month, because we knew that we would be down in Pittsburgh, not only for the birth, but also for her surgery, and then transferring to Children's and everything. So they started me with miso as soon as I did get into triage, and L&D was full. So they kept me in triage for several hours. They started the miso and planned to give me that every 4 hours until my cervix softened, because I was not at all ready for labor after the cervical check, which was awful, very painful. I was still extremely high and long, and so that just means that your cervix hasn't dropped for labor yet, which makes sense because I was only 37 weeks. So definitely not ready naturally yet, but that's okay. And let's see, so after about 6 hours, they checked me again, and I was 1 centimeter, 50% effaced, so still not moving very fast. I got a good night's sleep that night. We just slept in the L&D room, which they did move us to eventually later that evening. So we had our room set up, and they told me that they were going to be very strategic with what they gave me to induce labor, just because they were hoping for a daytime birth. And I've been told that a lot of times with Heart Warriors, they do try to aim for a daytime birth because there are so many teams and people needed to just make sure that everything goes smoothly. If it's a nighttime birth, that's okay too. There's plenty of people on call for that, but the teams that I had talked to specifically were shifted during the daytime. So we tried to make it a daytime birth, although the miso was not acting as quickly as we were hoping. So woke up around 6, and they checked again, although, you're sleeping, but every hour they're coming in to test you and give you an IV and check your testing, your contractions and everything. So it's not like you sleep super well, but in the morning they gave me 2 more rounds, and then they inserted a Foley bulb. Okay, yeah, they tried to, and it wasn't, I was still too long and high, so they weren't able to insert the Foley bulb right away, but then they came back a few hours later, and they started me on, let's see here, Pitocin. Okay, yeah, so they started me on Pitocin, and then a couple hours later inserted a Foley bulb, which I guess was some kind of mistake, because typically you do the Foley bulb first and then do Pitocin, but I guess it just wasn't communicated well, and so after the Foley bulb was inserted, I told them, I was like, I'm on Pitocin already, right? And they're like, no, but that's okay. It's already in, so there's not much we can do now. So it just lets take its place. And that was probably the most painful part of the whole 3-day birth, is because the Foley bulb is just awful. It basically forces your cervix open from a 1 to a 3. So I think that took about 30 minutes, which I'm thankful it wasn't longer. But once that fell out, I was able to just keep up on the Pitocin. And it looked like that day, it was now the 2nd, because I went in on December 1st for the ultrasound. So December 2nd, I continued Pitocin, and it was getting later in the day, so they realized it's not going to be a daytime birth today, so let's aim for tomorrow. Let's slow down the Pitocin, go back on the dosage, and then amp it up tomorrow. So the next day was kind of crazy, December 3rd. I seemed to be doing okay, but the contractions were not consistent, and I knew that it was because the belt, like I could feel all the contractions, but I knew that the belt was not picking up on the contractions because it wasn't adhering to my stomach very well, and it was hard. I kept explaining that to the nurses, but I guess it didn't go down the line and get conveyed correctly to the doctors, because from the main office, wherever they're looking at the monitors, but they're not in your room, it looked like I just was having irregular contractions. Oh, are you okay? You okay? Do you want this? And that Abbie was having some stressful heart rhythms too, and that, she wasn't acting like she was very comfortable. So they were concerned, and at one point, a bunch of doctors came in, and this was early in the morning, probably like 8 or maybe 9 o'clock, and they basically said, you're not having regular contractions, so we need to take you to get a C-section. And at that point, I was like so confused, because no one had mentioned C-section at all. No one had given me a timeline. No one seemed distressed. I had asked, is there a reason why I would need to go get a C-section? And I was told, at that point that there was not, and that everything was progressing smoothly. So for this to just come out of left field so abruptly was really frustrating. But they explained why, and my husband and I, they presented us with the paperwork, and we signed it because we wanted to make sure that whatever was done, whatever was the best interest of Abbie, that it would be done. But while we were there talking over the paperwork and signing it, thankfully one of the doctors had been looking at the monitors and saw that I was able to verbalize when each contraction was happening, and that it just wasn't being picked up on the monitor correctly. So I could feel the pain of each contraction, and I had gotten an epidural just the night prior, because it took me so long to get to 3 centimeters. So the epidural started the night before, but it had started wearing off, because it had been close to 12 hours by now, and because it was wearing off, I could tell when the contractions were, and I was still in pain. So as he was watching me be in pain very regularly, he realized that it was just the monitors not picking it up. So the need for a C-section was not as dire as they had thought when they were looking at the monitors outside of the room. So thankfully, Alex and I had talked to them about waiting a few hours and giving her more time, since it looked like I was doing okay and the baby was fine, as long as the contractions were regular. So they agreed to that, and they said, we'll wait like 2 or 3 more hours, and then we'll go ahead with the C-section. So thankfully, I was so amazed. But really soon after that, like 1 or 2 hours, obviously we were praying a lot that birth would happen soon, because I was just really scared at this point. And the main reason I didn't want to have a C-section was because I knew it would prolong the amount of time that I would have to stay at Magee Hospital while Abbie was transferred to Children's Hospital. So I didn't want to be away from her for 3 days. I thought that would be extremely stressful, and I didn't know when her surgery was going to be. And so we just decided, to try to push it off and try to give it another shot to give birth. So vaginally. So thankfully, within the next 2 hours, I felt a lot of pressure. It was somewhat painful because at this point the epidural had worn off, but it was still kind of hanging on. So I could feel movement, and then I felt a lot of pressure kind of all at once. You okay, love? I felt a lot of pressure all at once kind of hit my cervix, and I was like, oh my gosh, it feels like her head, but I can't tell, and I'm only, right before they checked, I was only 5 centimeters, so I knew I was still a long way away. I'd already been in labor for 2 days and was still only 5 centimeters, so I was like, there's no way that I went from 5 to 10 in an hour or two. And so at that point my doula was there, and I told her, like, I feel a lot of pressure. I think we should get checked again. And she said, okay, yeah, that's probably a good sign. Let me get the nurse. And the nurse checked, and actually I think it was a PA that came in and checked, and she was like, well, you feel pressure because the head is right here and you're ready to give birth. And I just burst into tears because I was so thankful that Abbie was finally there and that birth could happen, and that I was not getting a C-section like I thought I was, and that I could leave the hospital hopefully very soon after. So, you know, they rushed to get all of the doctors back in the room because there was a team, several teams. There was the team that was delivering, and then the team of pediatricians that were going to assess Abbie right after birth, and then the transport team that was going to take her to Children's. So there were lots of people in the room. There was the heart doctor and echo specialists and everything. So we pushed for about 20, maybe 30 minutes total. And within that time, everyone had gotten in the room and were ready, and she came out and they put her on my chest for maybe a couple minutes. Thankfully, I didn't know I was going to be able to have her on my chest before they took her, so I was very thankful for that, and we got some good birth photos that my wonderful doula took for us. And then they assessed her, got her weight, and gave her an echo, and they took her for assessment out of the room, but then brought her back. The paramedics brought her back right before transport. And she was in one of those big bubbles that they put on the truck, the EMT truck. And that was probably the scariest point up until then, just because the prostaglandins that we were told she would go on prohibit her from being able to breathe. And so while they keep the heart open, her respiratory rate was dropping, and she probably stopped breathing 4 or 5 times right in front of our eyes, which was very traumatic. And I just, was confused as to why they were bringing her back up to say goodbye if she was not being able to breathe. But it was a side effect of the medication, and, thankfully she was able to make it to Children's okay. And then Alex went with them. He drove behind the EMS and went with Abbie up to her room at the CICU, which is the Cardiac Intensive Care Unit. And he was there with her that night while I stayed behind at Magee. And my doula and friend helped me get settled into a post-birth room where I stayed that evening. And Abbie was assessed, and we got her information so I could call and get her updates, which Children's is incredible. We have such wonderful nurses taking care of the babies. And thankfully the next day, I did have some complications that prohibited me from being able to leave the next morning, but the next night I was able to leave. So I joined. Alex came and got me. I was still in a wheelchair, of course, but got to meet Abbie again up in her room and learn about all the monitors and the beeps. Yeah. And then got to meet the nurses, and we stayed really late the first night, like maybe till 1 or 2 a.m. And then, thankfully, a family from our church had given us their Airbnb to stay in while we were in the hospital because the Ronald McDonald House was full at capacity due to COVID restrictions. So there was no place for us to stay at the hospital. So thankfully this wonderful family gifted us with a place to stay nearby. So we drove there and went every morning to see Abbie and got updates. And I'll probably start another video just on her experience in the CICU and then to level 7A, which is the secondary unit that they learn how to feed before they're sent home. So that will be it for this video, but just wanted to share our birth experience. I know everyone's different, but there's lots of things, lots of decisions that go into where you're going to be giving birth, and I know I had a huge birth plan before our diagnosis of all these things I wanted, and then in the end it just kind of turned into, a hospital birth with the stirrups and all the medications and transport for her, so none of the things that I thought that I actually wanted, but in the end she was healthy and I was healthy, so it all worked out. Alright, so we'll start another part where we talk all about Miss Abbie. Yay! Bye-bye. Say bye-bye.